So when we mention Durban, we're referring to the 2001 United Nations World Conference Against Racism that took place from August 31st through September 7th in Durban, South Africa. We refer to this as a victory in the long battle for reparations, and it's a victory that we must claim because it's significant on several levels. First, Durban declared for the first time that the transatlantic slave trade was a crime against humanity. Prior to 2001, of course, the world knew that slavery happened, but it did not have a legal status that declared it a crime against humanity. Also, the Durban Declaration, the document that came out of this conference, declared that slavery was a crime against humanity, but also it put on an international agenda the justification for reparations, not just in one country, but everywhere that was affected by the slave trade. So essentially, the whole world. Additionally, when you think about Durban, you also have to take into account that the regional struggles for reparations dates back, at least in the United States, to 1783. But across the world, people were fighting struggles for reparations. But in 2001, the struggle for reparations truly became a pan African struggle, in that African people throughout the globe came together to pass the Durban Declaration and Program of Action and then linked our struggles from that point forward. In essence, we're talking about Durban representing the best of our reparation struggle and Pan Africanism. So, with that said, our conversation today is centered on the idea that from the very beginning that Durban was declared, the United States was the most hostile aggressor against any mention of reparations at the UN World Conference, which eventually, once reparations was on the agenda and it could not be taken off, the United States walked out of the conference. So before we get into the discussion, I want to play a short video commemorating the 25th year of Durban with the press conference that the December 12th movement had in August of 2021, right before 400 delegates left the United States to South Africa. This clip will be 2 minutes, and it'll show you some of the ideas that went into the conference itself.
In the fall of 2001, the Durban 400, a coalition of grassroots activists from the African diaspora, was formed to take the issue of reparations for the transatlantic slave trade to Durban, South Africa for the UN World Conference Against Racism, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerances. They demand for a final declaration that addresses the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism as crimes against humanity, and that reparations are due African descendants, was viewed by the United States government and their allies as inflammatory.
Be clear that our goal as Africans is to go to Durban to fight for the issue of the transatlantic slave trade as a crime against humanity, colonialism, a crime against humanity.
The Western press is reporting that the World Conference Against Racism won't be successful if the United States and its European allies do not participate. We take the opposite position. We say that we have forced the Western world up against the wall on the question of the transatlantic slave trade being a crime against humanity, the economic roots of racism being examined, and that reparations are owed African people throughout the world.
We're not talking about individuals when we talk about reparations. We're not talking about whether or not you're guilty or you're not guilty as an individual, and you have some guilt complex. We're talking about the culpability of governments and states.
So now they will have to come to Durban and put the issue on the table for the world to see.
That was just a brief clip, which sets the stage for us to have a conversation today. If you're on today and you're hearing about Durban or you're fairly unfamiliar, it's not by coincidence. Part of this commemoration is for people to remember the significance of Durban, the battle that was fought. And when we say a battle that was fought, we're talking about years of organizing, not just in the US, but across the globe. This struggle is one of which is grounded in our success for reparations and to unite African people into the future. With that being said, reparations and Durban is tied together, not just in the United States, but across the globe. So for that, we have representatives here from CARICOM, David Comishong from Barbados, but also Barbara Reynolds, who is here from Guyana, but also serves as the former director of the UN Working Group of Experts for People of African Descent. We have Roger Wareham from the December 12th movement, who were one of the principal organizers of the Durban 400, and Mauli Davis, who was also with National Black United Front, one of the other co-organizers of the Durban 400 and the following national reparations march in Washington, D.C. in 2002. So part of what we want to make sure that people understand about Durban today is that this was an act by African people who were part of civil society, grassroots organizing, but also people in official capacities as state actors, ambassadors, heads of states, etc. So with no further ado, we're going to start the conversation by first allowing our guests to introduce themselves and talk about their role in relationship to Durban. We'll start first with Roger Wareham from the December 12th movement.
Thank you. What I want to do is cover a little bit of what Jahi just covered. We made a decision because we've been fighting this battle for so long around the reparations and around the Durban Declaration that we had to take advantage of the fact that it's the 25th anniversary to put Durban and the DDP, the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, the DDPA, back on the pedestal where it belongs. So this past Wednesday, we held a press conference, which we saw as the launch of the campaign and also to announce this webinar. And so what I'm going to do is read the statement from that press conference and then just make a couple of comments and then turn it over. The statement from the December 12th movement. In 2001, African people achieved one of our greatest victories of the 21st century at the UN World Conference Against Racism held in Durban, South Africa. In its Durban Declaration and Program of Action, the international community for the first time declared that the transatlantic slave trade and slavery were crimes against humanity and that reparations are due the descendants of the victims of these crimes. Crimes against humanity have no statute of limitations, and thus the DDPA destroyed any international legal barrier to African people suing the colonizing and settler state colonies, which built their wealth on and owe their current power and status to stolen labor and stolen resources. The DDPA came out of a hard-fought battle between African people and the descendants of our former enslavers. The December 12th movement, along with the National Black United Front, NBUF, organized 400 people, as Jahi talked about the Durban 400, to go to Durban to lobby for our reparations demand. The U.S. vehemently opposed any discussion of reparations and, led by U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell, whom you remember was black, walked out of the conference once it was clear that reparations would remain on the agenda. The DDPA, a consensus document, was won through the leadership of a Pan-African collaboration between African and Caribbean countries and African people from throughout the diaspora. The Durban World Conference and the DDPA set the foundation for the current reparations movement in the U.S. and around the world. The DDPA is almost unknown in the U.S. because since 2001, the U.S. government has done everything in its power to disappear it. This reflects the same white supremacist imperial mindset, which is now actively and openly removing all positive references to Black people in books, schools, museums, monuments, and parks across the United States. Our renowned historian, Dr. John Henry Clark, said, quote, "History is a clock. It tells you where you have been, what you have been, where you are, and what you are. It is a compass for understanding one's place in the map of human geography." In the DDPA's 25th year, we are determined to put it back on the clock. We enter 2026 with the same conviction, vigor, and optimism that we took to Durban, and with the same slogan that guided our work. They stole us, they sold us, they owe us. Reparations now. And that was the kickoff to the press conference and to the campaign. I just wanted to add a couple of things before they turn it over to one of the other panelists. First is the importance of history that Dr. John Henry Clark talked about. And if we're going to acknowledge that, we have to acknowledge the role of Sister Iman Drama and Brother Al Santana, who produced the Durban 400, because it is a visual, video, audio recording of what went on, what was the depth of organizing of African people and what it took to achieve the Durban 400. And it's almost like a handbook in terms of international organizing for us to achieve a common goal. And so I just want to shout out to them about that. If you have not seen it, you should see it. It's on YouTube and on Vimeo. And I spoke with Sister Iman, and she said she's working on getting subtitles so it can be broadcast in other languages and be accessible to people. I think I'll stop at this point and turn it back over to Jahi.
Thank you, Roger. A lot of good information. For all the participants who are hearing about some of this for the first time, we will send out a reference to everything mentioned in this webinar, the Durban 400 video, the press statement that was actually given that Roger just read on January 7th. Then, of course, anything else that comes up along the way. And if you were a part of Durban and you have some references or things to share, the follow-up email will be something that you can send to us. And we want to make sure that, everything that we talk about today is accessible to everybody who has a continued interest in getting involved and organizing around Durban. So with no further ado, I will pass it over to David Kamishang, the ambassador to CARICOM from Barbados.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Greetings, brothers and sisters from the Republic of Barbados. I want to begin by thanking the December 12th movement for keeping their eyes on the prize and keeping this laser-like focus on the Durban Declaration and Program of Action over the past 25 years, because when you examine it, it really is the foundational achievement, the foundational document upon which all of the subsequent reparations, victories, and infrastructure has been built. I had the good fortune to be involved in the Durban process from the very beginning. Back in the year 1999, I was the director of the Barbados government's Commission for Pan-African Affairs. And so I was on the Barbados delegation to the Americas region preparatory meeting for the World Conference Against Racism. It was held in Chile in the year 2000. And it was at that preparatory meeting that we first came face to face with the violent opposition of the US and Canadian governments to anything to do with declaring slavery a crime against humanity or anything that made a case for reparations. So when we got to that preparatory conference, UN conference in Chile, that is what we were confronted with. We were confronted with the American delegation saying to all of us that this World Conference will have nothing to do with historical slavery. It will have nothing to do with reparations. And in essence, that they were laying down the law as to what this World Conference would be all about. And of course, we locked horns because we had gone to that preparatory meeting specifically to put the issue of reparations on the international agenda. And as you would know, the United States of America was accustomed to having its way in the Western Hemisphere, that part of the world that they consider to be their backyard. And usually, the governments of these Western Hemisphere countries would simply fall in line with the instructions of the US. But we took on the US. And I must say, to bring home how trenchant their opposition was, at one point, the head of the US delegation to that UN preparatory conference actually accosted me and Jamaica's permanent secretary in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the corridors of that conference center. And we almost came to physical blows. And the man was livid. He said, you people think you can indict us and try us and sentence us? And we asked him, who is this you people you're talking about? Anyhow, it really got intense. And it actually led us to make an official complaint to the US State Department about the behavior of this person. And he was sent back home. He was sent back home, but they sent out his replacement. And of course, he was a white man, but they made sure that his replacement was a black woman who, when she met me at the conference, when she came and met me, she accused me of being the person who was terrorizing her delegation. To cut a long story short, the US and Canada did everything possible at that conference to keep any resolution having to do with reparations off the agenda. And we came right down to the final minutes of the conference. And by then, their duplicity and dishonesty and lack of integrity had become so clear that even those Latin American governments that tended to be so compliant began to defy them. And the chairman of the conference said, we are going to pass this resolution based on not unanimity, but based on a majority vote. And so that is how we got texts coming out of this hemisphere about reparations onto the draft agenda of the UN conference. But of course, our African brothers and sisters were able to put forward even stronger texts about slavery being a crime against humanity, because they did not have to contend with a US and a Canada in their preparatory conference. And I know of the very important work that the December 12th movement played in working with the African caucus to help produce resolutions that came out of that caucus. But the point is that, yes, Durban was a tremendous, tremendous breakthrough. The whole process, not just the Durban conference itself, but all of the preparatory meetings at UN headquarters in Geneva, it helped us. We all came together from across global Africa, and we formed this very powerful lobby. And I just give you one example. During that preparatory process in Geneva, the vice president of the National Urban League approached me, and he wanted Barbados to help him to put a resolution forward condemning racial profiling in police investigations. And I said to him, but your government is here. Why don't you approach your government about putting forward this racial profiling resolution? And he said to me that the American government will never admit in an international forum that this problem exists in the United States. And so Barbados partnered with the National Urban League. We sat down together, we drafted the resolution, and it was ultimately passed. It's number 72 of the Durban Program of Action. I have the text here: urges states to design, implement, and enforce effective measures to eliminate the phenomenon popularly known as racial profiling, comprising the practice of police and other law enforcement officers relying to any degree on race, color, descent, or national or ethnic origin as the basis for subjecting persons to investigatory activities or for determining whether an individual is engaged in criminal activity. That was passed. That is part of the Durban Program of Action, and that was the result of the collaboration between the government of Barbados and the National Urban League. Just to give one example of how powerful this Pan-African process became. And so we came away from Durban with this wonderful document. Roger is right. The only reason the United States walked out is because, having tried to lay down the law way back in 2000 at that preparatory meeting in Chile, that this World Conference would have nothing to do with historical slavery or reparations, they had lost that battle. And they recognized, how powerful this idea of racial justice was, that it was able to even mobilize against them governments that were normally so compliant. And so since Durban, we have gone on to build an international reparations movement. I think we now have a global reparations movement. So many positive things were built upon that Durban process, including the CARICOM reparations campaign, which was launched in 2013. We have the CARICOM Reparations Commission. We have the CARICOM 10-point plan. It is now being developed into a full-fledged reparations manifesto. And we have at the UN, the working group of experts on people of African descent. That came out of Durban. The United Nations Permanent Forum on People of African Descent, the UN Working Group for the Implementation of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, the International Decade for People of African Descent. All of that was built upon Durban. And the most recent development, I would say, is at the African Union on the African continent. They have just established their group, their Committee on Reparations, their group of legal experts on reparations. They are about to establish their own program and agenda for reparations. They're working with CARICOM. So a global movement has taken shape. And I want to end by saying it is clear to me that as wonderful as the CARICOM 10-point plan and the new reparations manifesto is, the foundation document really is that Durban Declaration and Program of Action, and and all of our reparations institutions need to be made conscious of that. I am going to propose to our CARICOM Reparations Research Institute that they compile all of the subsequent texts built upon Durban, put it together with the original Durban Declaration Program of Action, and let us produce a concise reparations manual that we can use to help us and to guide us in the important work that we have to do in this year and in the years ahead to achieve reparations globally for our people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. You dropped a lot of great, valuable information. And just to reiterate, there will be a resource guide following this meeting, which lists some of the institutions and mechanisms that you mentioned, along with the webinar. This will also be posted and emailed out, a link that can be accessed either through our December 12th website or through our Vimeo video account. One of the mechanisms that David mentioned was the UN Working Group of Experts for People of African Descent. With us, we have Barbara Reynolds, the former chair of the working group, who has done tremendous work in uplifting, and especially in the case of the United States, the human rights violations of African people here, which beyond mechanisms like the working group, the United States does everything in its power to deny that racism even exists. So we want to hear now from Barbara Reynolds.
Thank you very much, moderator. And it's not too late to wish everybody a happy 2026. I don't know about you, but I live and work in Trinidad, and it started out with a bang. Not a big bang that has flattered us, but certainly the events over the last couple of weeks have been arresting in my mind. I came back from the Pan-African Congress in Togo with a sense of commitment, recommitment, with a sense that there were pathways to progress. And I must confess, my world has been rocked, I don't know about you, a little bit, with what I see and hear. I don't know if anybody has seen this official statement on X from the US State Department on the Permanent Forum. Apart from the questionable diplomacy that kind of governs state departments around the world, it's the vitriol that is coming out of that and that is spawning the kind of comments from people who are across the globe that is of concern to me. I was in Durban in 2001. I actually was moving from New York to Nigeria as I worked with UNICEF. But I grew up in UNICEF on world conferences, whether it was the World Conference on Education for All, which was my bread and butter, to the World Summit for Children. That was our bread and butter. Those were the peaks of enthusiasm and energy. And then the troughs were now translating those into programs of action that were actionable and monitored and evaluated. I wanted to make that point because I think that we're at a point now, Roger, Ambassador Commission, colleagues, that post-Durban, we still don't have some kind of clear, actionable set of goals that we could monitor. In other words, and I've said this before, what would success look like? When can our children and grandchildren heave a sigh of relief and said, okay, after 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years, we've done it. And this is what we fought for. This is what many people gave up their lives for. And here we are. And I think it's important that we kind of coalesce around what the success looked like. The second point is I make that statement because as our report from our 37th session on reparatory justice, at which you spoke, Roger, as that report pointed out and signposted, because of where we are in the 21st century, there will be multiple pathways to reparations, to reparatory justice. Global Africa is diverse. Global Africa is so diverse that various subparts are on different points in their own trajectory, whether it's about awareness or action or ideology. Global Africa is diverse in purpose and diverse and therefore has to be diverse in how we achieve what we want to achieve. And so there needs to be a conversation around that. I hear Ambassador Commission talking about a global movement. And the idea and ideal of a global movement is very welcome. The challenges inherent in that, I don't underestimate. Let me make my third point about this. In the late 40s, 50s, and 60s, there was one thing that consumed what we now call global Africa: independence. That was a driving force. It was a unifying force. I can sit here and recite the names of the leaders who fought for and who gave their lives for independence. We're in a different world now. Global Africa is not that. But I think that reparatory justice or reparations is this next big moment for global Africa that can grab our attention and shake us into some kind of ideal, some type of idea that brings us together before whoever they are. And there are some of us who look like us, not all skin folk or kinfolk, before some of us actually succeed in driving apart. And so this third idea of reparatory justice or reparations as a unifying idea that signals that our history and our destiny bind us together, I think is something that we have to seize and ensure that we pass it on and that it makes sense to us. Why seize it and pass it on? Well, we see the pushback and we see the backlash, okay? That's one. But also, global Africa is so diffuse that assassinating a Sankara or undermining, an Nkrumah is not going to work now. That period is gone. But by that very token, the goals that younger people in global Africa have are so diverse that we've got to grab something and ensure that this narrative of who we are works through our history and kind of signpost our destiny and what success will be. Let me mention two other things. Yes, the states parties, the members of the UN, are important. They are the successors of the enslavers, the empire builders, and the colonizers. We also have to work much more, I think, in parallel at engaging the church. The church that blessed enslavement and gave that kind of moral license and even imperative to go ahead and do it. And we also have to engage the successors of the transnational corporations that have fueled financially enslavement and colonization. And we see it today. We see it in the fact that economically, global Africa, despite all the things that we can list about the things above the ground, below the ground, under the sea, and above the sea, that still we don't command that global wealth that we need. So, Roger, I'm at 6 minutes. Let me say one other thing, because I know that's where we need to be. The thing that bothers me is the distraction within the global movement, within global Africa, the distractions and therefore the dispersion of energy. So let me give you a classic example. If you're sitting in the room negotiating around the declaration, which I think global Africa must pick up as one of its pillars of success, we have spent hours talking about the use of the word intersectorality. Now, I wear a wig, so metaphorically speaking, I pull my hair out about wasting so many hours talking about whether intersectorality should be in the declaration or not. That's the kind of thing I think we need to do some homework about and get that out of the agenda and focus on land rights, land ownership, land use, land tenure in the declaration and the right to development. And my position is if the use of intersectorality will take us off our game, I'll be happy to take that out and deal with it somewhere else. Now that could be heathen, but that's where so that's one. The second thing I think is that we need to educate ourselves across the spectrum that when we talk about reparatory justice, it is not just cut the check. Cutting the check may very well be the last thing that happens, but there's so much more that has to be done. If we look about the reimagining of spaces and places going on in places like Barbados and now Brazil, if we look at the need for revisiting laws and constitutions that are still running through our 21st century systems. So it's a whole list of things that must be done. Huh? And the third thing about that is to coalesce around two other things that the working group has done a lot of work around. And that is environmental justice, simply because environmental justice was not as well articulated as we see it and understand it now 25 years ago, even going back to the decades of all the global conferences. But it's so very important for economy, for culture, for society, and God bless our hearts. I salute every Jamaican because that was another thing that rocked my world coming into 2026. And the last point is digital justice. Why? Because the warfare ahead of us right now is not going to be guns. It may be germs. I don't know if it's still steel, but it's definitely going to be digital. And so we have to wrap our arms around what happens in our schools, how we become digital natives, how we have digital specialists to help us navigate the future. I close by saying we have to focus not just on the history of the past, which informs and inspires us, but we have to dissect our current context and set multiple pathways for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Barbara. I want to uplift a statement that you made where you said we don't have clear, actionable sets of goals to monitor the success of the DDPA. We want to come back to that a little bit later. But you also mentioned some terms that we also want to come back to, particularly the idea that reparations for African people it could be the global unifying force as was decolonization was in the earlier period. So we want to come back to those points. Up next, we have Mally Davis, who is a member of the National Black United Front, which is the organization that, being a native Chicagoan, was the one who introduced me to the Durban conference, particularly alongside Conrad Worrell. So, with no further ado, I want to give us our last speaker before we start engaging some of the things that's come up and then some of the questions from the audience as well. So, Mally Davis.
All right, peace and blessings, everybody. It is an honor to join you on behalf of the National Black United Front. We say forward ever, backwards never. I am here, honored to really uplift the work and the continued work of MBUF, now our current uh, national chair, Kofi Tahaka. We remember the powerful work of now ancestor and my political godfather, Chairman Conrad Worrell. And we recently had a passing of one of the elders from Houston who was involved in the work in Durban from MBUF, and we want to lift up his name, Baba Yawo. So we just want to, again, elevate a couple of things from MBUF's perspective and the work that was put in. And I now teach as a lecturer at Clark Atlanta University, and we have a pre-law scholars program. And I think it's critically important that I take a few moments to highlight some what I think are teaching points in this Pan-African movement towards reparations that I learned. So to give context, at the time in 2001, I was in my third year of law school. So I was not a lawyer yet. And so I was really a worker bee, just kind of a fly on the wall, really learning from the great organizers and seeing people who I had just heard about and being able to move with them and really observe what the organizing was like. And so I'd like to, because I think it's always important for our young people to get an understanding of that. They see us now, but I want our young people to really think about what I saw as a younger person. And I was, still late 20s, early 30s, but I would just want them to think about here's some pieces to give some context. First, nothing happens in a vacuum. This didn't just pop up, right? This work didn't just come out of nowhere. There had been a lot of work in advance, and I was very fortunate to receive an email from Toriano Granger, who was InBuff board member at the time and traveled to Durban and laid out some of that history. And I just want to share a little bit of it. So the international work that InBuff was initially doing was really after the expose of how the CIA was involved in putting crack into the Black community. And so it was We Charge Genocide that was engaged in 1996, 97 time frame. So I just want the young people to understand how these movements are built upon. And so during that work, there was a reflection back to We Charge Genocide from William Patterson and Paul Robeson from 1951. And so MBUF collects over 156,000 signatures and ultimately takes it to Geneva, Switzerland, with a group with a MBuff delegation. And so that really was a introduction for MBuff into the international scene. That then ultimately leads to this alliance and deep collaboration with the December 12th movement. And so now so lesson one is this: where we sit now, everything that we all are experiencing, the fights that we're fighting are built upon a long legacy of struggle and movement work that organizations and individuals have been engaged in. But the second piece is this notion that we cannot work together. Here's an example of MBuff, December 12th, and a lot of other organizations saying, we got different ideological issues. We're setting all that aside. I think Sister Barbara just raised that. We set that stuff aside. That's what I observed as a young person. It inspired me as an organizer to see the strong personalities of a Conrad Worrell and a Viola Plumber, and everybody figuring out how do we move forward and be on one accord and be disciplined. And so I lift that up as, again, a critical point. MBuff was organizing people around the country through its historical roots in Kansas City, in Atlanta, in Detroit, in all of these different places that MBuff had emerged after its founding in the 80s. And so at the time, MBuff was 21, 22 years old. And so again, it gives the context of how we are able to come together and build. The third piece is the what I just describe as a apprenticeship. Um, I was in law school, but I was not asked to speak when we were in Durban. I was asked to carry somebody's bag to make sure some of the elders, like Baba Hannibal Afrique, who was there from Chicago, was able to participate in the march. When he got too tired, we had to sit him down, let him get his breath, and then keep organizing it. So, unfortunately, we have turn organizing into celebrity. And so people want to just emerge and be. and the idea of working under seasoned organizers has is not as prevalent as it was. We used to call it sitting at the feet of our elders. But obviously with Conrad and D12 and the organizers, there was no sitting. We were moving and organizing. And then the final piece that I think is critically important is I was able, they sent me, Brother Kofi sent me the list of the hotels because we had a list when we were in Durban of the hotels and the names of the people. And when I look at the names of the people, these were ordinary Black people. These weren't rich people. These weren't just professors. These were ordinary Black people who put their money together because they heard a call and they said, we should be there. We should organize. We should be present and put our bodies in this space and learn how to. We didn't know what we were doing, some of us. Obviously, Roger and everyone and Sister Colette, they had been to these United Nations and to these international gatherings. We just came under the guise of, this is in the spirit of Malcolm X. This is in the spirit of Paul Robeson. We got to just show up, take instruction, be humble, and figure this out, and then attempt as best we could to engage our the African group to challenge the Western European group. And that's what we did. And so there is still room and space for grassroots organizing on an international level. And that was one of the lessons that I hope would not be lost from this incredible Durban 400. And then last but not least, I do need to share while I am here as an MBUF representative, as I was watching the Durban 400, and I'm going to show it in my to my pre-law scholars at Clark Atlanta this semester, and hopefully you all can join us in talking to our young people. I saw so many of my NCBL. I am now the president-elect of NCBL. I saw John Musan Kofa. I saw the whole New York crew of lawyers from NCBL who were a part of the Durban 400. So I just want us to really understand the cross collaboration, the Pan-African nature of the work and the grassroots movement that allowed this historic victory. And we are absolutely right in claiming this victory. One of the things that I was taught, and I'll be quiet after this, was I was reminded of Milcar Cabral: tell no lies, claim no easy victories. That was a rallying cry all throughout our time in Durban. And we don't have to tell any lies. This is a victory. We won that, and we're building upon that win. And I am in the reparations movement now, doing work locally because of that victory. So it's impacted us on individual, collective, and organizational levels. On behalf of MBUF, straight ahead.
Thank you, Mally, for that. I actually do want to stick to what you just mentioned about the people who attended the Durban conference. Of course, um, the conference attracted people from across the world. And of course, when you think about the UN, you think about official titles, ambassadors, heads of state, stuff like that. But you spoke of ordinary people. And when we speak about the Durban 400, we're talking about 400 grassroots activists who used their own money, booked their own hotels, and made the flight to Durban. So I want the guests, the panelists, to speak about the importance of what is called the civil society in the UN space, which to me is just the ordinary people you mentioned. Can you all speak to the importance of having that aspect of our community involved in the UN and other international spaces and the type of effect it can have? So, Mally, if you want to pick it back up, or if somebody else wants to jump in, please talk about not just the Durban 400, but I would imagine in the case of Barbados and other places, it was people who were part of the grassroots who also participated.
If
Yes.
I could just share this really quick. Um, the build up organizing is something that we should not leave off. It's not like a trip was booked as you might go with your family and say, hey, we're going to South Africa. All of the build-up work to first educate on local levels, the conferences, that year in July, the NBUF theme was around reparations because it was all roads lead to Durban. And so there was education throughout. So the first we could understand what was the significance. What's the World Conference Against Racism? Right. And so I think sometimes as seasoned organizers, we forget the political education that has to happen to gain that grassroots momentum. And we can't skip any steps. Those fundamental teaching allowed us. I didn't have the money to go. My mother, right? I'm a law student. My mother, well, I had to explain it to her. After which, when we went to New York, she got on a bus from Chicago and went to New York. Then when we were in DC, we had folks get on a bus from Atlanta and come to DC for the millions for reparations. All of that is political organizing, person to person. And my aunt, who is now an ancestor, got on that bus with my mother. She didn't have political bone in her body. But because my mom said this is something we should do, so we have to not walk past any of our community members and think, well, they not wearing a dashiki, they not doing this. Now our folk know that U.S. imperialism at this moment is at an all-time high, and that somebody has to resist. And if we offer spaces of resistance, I believe our people will continue to join the work and engage in that grassroots organizing that's necessary for us to be victorious. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Mally. Barbara, do you want to comment? You said not only is it important, but you say it's foundational that the grassroots are involved. Can you speak more on that?
Look, it's imperative. Grassroots people go to the polls. Grassroots people who vote. Leaders, one vote. Well, up to now. I don't know what's going to change. But up to now, it's one vote, one person. Okay? Grassroots people are our classroom teachers. Grassroots people do research. Grassroots people are our actors and artisans and athletes. We're grassroots people. I'm a grassroots person. I'm going to spend another 2 years on the working group, but then I go back to doing what I was doing before. It was an NGO that wrote me in to be on the working group. And it's very important that we understand that each of us has a little bit of a space somewhere that has to be filled. A lot of what I've done over the last couple of years is I'm always doing this kind of informal, unscientific poll. I ask people at the university level, so what have you done for the International Decade of the People of African Descent? And they say, what? And I won't name the most famous university in my part of the world. And they say, what? And then you go and you try to explain. I look at the newspapers. I try to pinpoint how many articles are there in the newspapers that are talking, our newspapers in the Caribbean, about the issues that are so important to us. There is very little. Okay. So how we get it into the bloodstream, the brain cells of our people is the task for us, because that's where the shift is going to take place. That's where the real momentum will take place. We're not there yet. It's fluttering somewhere here in rooms and all of that. That's where it's going to take place. Let me mention one other thing, and I'm picking up on what Professor Davis just said. So about Roger, I haven't mentioned this, and I hope I'm not breaking any rules, so I'll apologize afterwards. About 2 months before our 37th session, which is our public session that we just had in Geneva in November, which focused on migration, which was much better than I thought it was. It was actually pretty good. We were told as the working group that there was no money for the session about 2 months before. You know what we did? The members paid their tickets and paid their hotel bills to go to Geneva and hold a session. There was a little bit of flack from some people. I'm sure there'll be other comments. But the point is, we have on record that that session went ahead. We have on record the inputs from member states. We have on record the discussion and the conclusions. And so this adds to our body of work. We're grassroots people, okay? This adds to our body of work, which we now need to find a way to disseminate so that other people can have a look at it. Migration is not just a hot topic. Migration is our life. Human beings have always been on the move. We will continue to move, and the tentacles or the ripple effect of migration is about all our lives. So I just use that as an example. You can redact it from the official record. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Roger, before you chime in, I kind of want to, intersperse some of the comments or questions we're getting from the audience as well. So you can also touch on the grassroots activist question, but we also had a comment from the audience that asked about also the role of NCOBRA. So when we talk about the Durban 400, December 12th, NBUF was discussed. Can you talk about the role of also NCOBRA in that? And after Roger, we want David to also comment on the role of the grassroots organizing, also in the continued work of CARICOM, and particularly as you all met with the African Union recently. So Roger, then David.
Okay, good. That was a point that I wanted to make when I was talking about the shout out to the Durban 400 around when you see the film, you'll see not only folks from D12 and NBUF, but a lot of the stalwarts from NCOBRA who were part of, historically part of that whole drive for reparations, and were an integral part of that Pan-African drive of us unifying. And I think the point Barbara made, and it's the point that we made all along, was that people came to the World Conference, and these were grassroots people from Colombia, from Brazil, from Honduras, from Europe, from Australia, and they came with a particular examples they had of how slavery, the legacies of slavery and structural racial capitalism affected them. And they're coming to the UN, they want to make that the top of the issue. And what we were able to do was to get African people together to see if we can get to the point around the transatlantic slave trade and slavery as a crime against humanity and reparations, then that will begin to address all the particular manifestations of how we're affected. And so that was the success of it. Not simply that grassroots people came to the World Conference, but that usually when grassroots people come to the World Conference, they go to the NGO Forum, which runs parallel for around 4 or 5 days. And we had learned from our experience in 1993 at the UN World Conference on human rights and the summit in Beijing, the Women's Summit in Beijing, that the NGO Summit is important, but it's the most important thing is what comes out of the conference, and that's where the states are. And so that the Durban 400's focus was on coming to lobby the states. We had been involved in the UN since 1989. We had learned, particularly from our Cuban comrades, around how is it that you make an impact? So when we brought people, it was to lobby to the states, the ones that were for or against it in terms. So that was just very, very important, and certainly, and NCOBRA along was an integral part of that. I think that and also, when we're using NCBL is the National Conference of Black Lawyers, because everybody doesn't know that. They should. Just like when we say DDPA, we're talking about the Durban Declaration. So just so that people know. willingness, I think the willingness of people to put aside, let me give an example. The one of the struggles that is going on around the DDPA, first of all, is the way that the US has slithered out of it, is to say that they withdrew because it was anti-Semitic. And that's the same thing they're doing now in terms of trying to justify collaboration in genocide, participation in genocide. The Palestinians who were part of that whole motion agreed, they decided not to make the Palestine-Israel conflict a key element of the Durban Declaration because they saw it would derail the whole motion in terms of the real push around the designation of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery. So that was not an issue at Durban. And if anyone takes the time to read the Durban Declaration, there's nothing anti-Israel, and it mentions the right of Israel to exist and the right of Palestine to exist. But the U.S. continues to push that to confuse people. And so back to the question of we understood that the role of average people is the non-glamorous folks was key, and that's as Molly said, everybody financed themselves. There was no foundation. Nobody was getting paid. Everybody agreed to do it. And as somebody said at the press conference, and as Esmeralda Simmons said at the press conference, they came to South Africa and they worked. They were not going on tours or not going on safari. They came to work, and that was one of the real reflections of that success.
Thank you, Roger. David, before you go, I guess I want to present you with the question that came from Kenneth Henry of In Cobra. Shout out to Kenneth. She asked, please speak more on what is being done to grow the international grassroots movement for reparations. Who is doing what, and how can organizations get more involved? So, David, in your comment about the grassroots, can you speak to Kenneth's question or concern about grassroots organizations getting more involved on an international level?
Yeah, sure. When I went to Durban, when I got involved in the World Conference process, I was working for the government of Barbados. I was the director of the Commission for Pan-African Affairs. I was appointed to that post in 1998. But for many, many years before that, I was a civil society Pan-African activist. And in fact, it was coming out of my experience at the 7th Pan-African Congress in Uganda in 1994 that I came back to Barbados with a determination that our local Pan-African movement had to have some presence, some institutional presence within the state of Barbados. And it was actually people like me who were responsible for getting the government of Barbados to establish the Commission for Pan-African Affairs as a Pan-African entity within the government of Barbados. So when I went to Geneva in 2001 for those preparatory meetings, the whole UN process was absolutely new to me. I knew virtually nothing about the UN process. And I found a bald-headed fella in Geneva called Roger Wareham.
I didn't have hair in those days.
Who was very knowledgeable about the UN process and who had attached himself to the African ambassadors in UN at the UN in Geneva, and who made it his business to establish a link between me, and by me, because I was often the leader of the Barbados delegation to Geneva and our African brothers and sisters. And that proved to be, a very powerful development because we were then able to speak to each other and to collaborate during those preparatory meetings in Geneva. And you should know that at a UN World Conference, the vast majority of work is done before you actually get to the conference itself. The really critical work is done during the preparatory conferences when you actually prepare the draft text that goes into the final conference. And the US had a the US were determined that that Durban conference was not going to come off. And they did everything possible during the Geneva process to tie up the text, the draft text, in so many contradictions and that we would have nothing really. We would have no consensus. We would have nothing to take to Durban. And we had to be very astute in counteracting that. But the point is, so I'm making the point that Roger on December 12th, who I learned had become a member of the UN ECOSOC and had some status within the UN system, played a very important role in helping to motivate and shape the work that our governments ended up doing. I also need to say that we we mobilized, particularly in this Western Hemisphere, a very powerful Pan-Africanist civil society movement around preparing for Durban. And I was part of that because although I was with the government, but coming out of my civil society background and the fact that the government agency I was leading was about Pan-Africanism. So we all came together, several meetings, whether in New York, in Toronto, bringing our Latino brothers, bringing all of the Pan-African activists of this hemisphere together and establishing these relationships. Washington, going to the NCOBRA conference in Washington, multiple events where we all came together and worked on this civil society agenda, this civil society work that was fed in to governmental processes and that helped to influence and to motivate governmental processes. So that was a perfect example of how activism needs to work. There must be a connection between the Pan-Africanist civil society elements and the governmental elements if you're to be truly effective. Because as Roger said, at the end of the day, it is what those governmental delegations produce that became the text of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. Now, when CARICOM, when our heads of government in 2013 decided that CARICOM was going to embark on a reparations campaign, they mandated that every member state of CARICOM must establish a national reparations commission appointed by the government, and that would be the fundamental building block of our reparations infrastructure. So that is a model that we have implemented, and the members of those national reparations commissions, in the case of Barbados, we call it a task force. They tend to be grassroots, civil society, representatives of the grassroots civil society, Pan-Africanist organizations that have been involved in reparations work long before our governments came to this mission. And so typically in a CARICOM governmental national task force on reparations, you're going to have representatives of the Rastafari community, representatives of Pan-African organizations. You're going to have university professors who have a deep interest in African history, African political science, and so forth. So the point I'm making is that even though these are quote unquote governmental structures appointed by the government, the people who populate these committees and task forces are really people, Pan-Africanists of the civil society. So I can say that, and then the CARICOM heads of government have given okay. So in CARICOM, so we have the national commissions, and then the chairperson of every national commission is brought together in a region-wide CARICOM reparations commission, which is now the regional body, and that body is chaired by Hilary Beckles, who is a eminent historian, and he's also the vice chancellor of the University of the West Indies. But that region-wide CARICOM Reparations Commission has been given the authority to admit into associate membership reparations organizations, Pan-African organizations that are pursuing reparations once they have some kind of Caribbean connection. And so several Caribbean organizations have been integrated as associate members, some of them coming from outside CARICOM, from the US Virgin Islands, for example, from the Dutch territories. Also, we are now having from the Central American mainland organizations applying for associate membership. We have Caribbean repatriate communities in organizations in Ethiopia that will be applying as well. So that is part of the building of this global movement that has a very strong grassroots component that I can speak about. The African process is now unfolding. Of course, I don't know it as well as I know the Caribbean process. I have been invited by the African Union to be a member of their committee of legal experts on reparations. So I am actually the only person from outside the continent of Africa who is a member of that legal committee. And I know that Ambassador June Suma of St. Lucia, she has been invited to be a member of their overall African Union Commission, Reparations Commission. And I think she's the only person from outside the continent who is a member. So maybe you would say, well, we are two token members, but to their credit, they've actually at least reached out, even if it's only one member, reached out beyond the continent of Africa. But that's a process that is still young, it is still unfolding, and I can't speak definitively about the extent to which the grassroots and the civil society has been integrated into that process. But I trust that, just like with the Caribbean, that will happen as well. Thank you.
Go ahead, Mally.
Thank you. I must apologize to my Cobra comrades. I am a Cobra Life member, and a booklet that Conrad Worrell wrote in 2001, and there's a section in here. It's entitled "In Buff Genocide and the Reparations Movement," and the significance of it, again, as we talked about how movements are built upon prior movements. Just for for context, I first connect with Baba Conrad in the African Center Education Movement. When I come back from my time in Spain, I was active duty Navy, and we were organizing and brought him there to teach on the base. So this is a very different time. Obviously, they have outlawed Black History Month on any military installation today, but back then we physically brought Conrad Worrell's sister. Brother Leon Harris, Anderson Thompson, Sister Yvonne Jones onto the base to teach. And so part of that was when I got back to the States, he said the reparations movement, you got to join in Cobra. And that is the space that we need to organize in. And so in this booklet, he talks, and I just want to read this one section because I want us to be clear about the impact of the various mass movement nature of the reparations movement when he talks about the 12th annual convention of N'COBRA was in Baton Rouge, June 22nd through the 24th in '01. And the work of N'COBRA has helped spark the mass character of the reparation movement and its intensification. And he specifically, just again, to tap into the energy, he specifically talks about Sister Kathy Hambrick had established a River Road African American Museum. And on this plantation, they felt the spirit of the ancestors in the libation ritual. And I just want to read this section and move on, but I don't ever want us to divorce the work we're doing from the spiritual work. My good brother, Brother Jamoke, has always kept reminding that this is spiritual work, political work, but it's spiritual in nature because of the work of the ancestors. But it reads as this: the leader said, "To our ancestors, in your honor," the group responds, "we promise to assume our responsibility in continuing to struggle and build upon the foundation you have laid before us." The leader says, "To our ancestors, in your honor," and the group says, "we promise to reclaim our cultural heritage stripped and stolen from you and us and rebuild a new world, our children, for our children, based on our traditional cultural principles and values." And I think that is incredibly important in this moment in the reparations movement as you see forces that are attempting to de-Africanize us so that we are not unified across the globe. Um, and that's something that we have to lift up. And then lastly, um, Congressman Cynthia McKinney on June 19th of 2001, again leading up, this again shows the build-up work, had the Black Caucus Roundtable discussion, and the representatives were attorney, my mentor and friend, Mama Ajwa Ayatora of N'COBRA, another one of my leaders in Kishi Taifa, Viola Plummer, Roger Wareham, Raymond Wimbush, and Dr. Conrad Worrell were all a part of that roundtable. So I just want us to keep lifting up the history so that it highlights the kind of detailed work that happens in advance, and that this was not an event. This was and continues to be a movement built upon very strategic organizing and successes and failures, right? From the past where we may not have known how to move. The benefit of December 12th being in this space, and then the benefit of N'COBRA having done this reparations work, all of that converges into this victory that we now highlight. And I would lastly encourage all of us to do some kind of program around the Durban Declaration this year from our different organizations. So we're going to do something as it relates to Clark Atlanta and invite y'all so that our students can hear directly from you. But wherever we are, we have to elevate this victory and build upon it and talk about the challenges that we're now facing. And we're excited about doing that through NCBL and Cobra, MBUF, as well as the other entities that are organizing in the reparation space in this moment.
Thank you, Mally, for that, especially just naming the whole Chicago crew. So not just Conrad World, but Anderson Thompson, Yvonne Jones, Leon
Yes,
Thompson.
yes.
So yeah, that history is there. We have to write about it. And also thank you for highlighting that we should all be doing something throughout the year to keep Durban at the forefront of how we think about and understand reparations, but also our other politics. So we're at 126, but we want to make sure at least the last 10 minutes of this session, we talk about some of the things that we're doing or plan on doing to highlight Durban throughout the year. And that way, other people who are hearing, they might have some ideas, but ultimately, we want to share what people are doing. Um, I'm going to go to Roger, then Barbara, but after Roger and Barbara's comments, I'm going to try to synthesize some of the comments that we have from the audience because they're touching on some significant themes and part of what has been touched on to some degree already, but not really been the focus. So after Roger and Barbara, we're going to go into some more of the audience questions.
Thank you. I just wanted to make a point. I think one of the real important points of Durban was highlighting the existence of African people in the Americas who don't speak English, and let me just do a shout out that part of the folks who came were from Canada, but the ones who don't speak English, starting with Santiago, when we went to Santiago, and that David talked about in 2000, there were folks there from Brazil, there were folks there from Colombia. I think people had some perception that there were a lot of Black people in Brazil. It's like 100 million. There are 15 million in Colombia. They were in Honduras, the Garifuna, and and so I think it drew a spotlight to the fact that there are Black folks that, as somebody said the other day at the press conference, like 90% of the Africans who came from the continent during the slave trade didn't come to the United States. They went throughout Central and South America. And so there's this large population who are marginalized in their country, who that racism affects them, and you don't hear about them. Let me just give you a quick example. At the United Nations, the representatives from Brazil, if you looked at the representatives from Brazil, you would not know there was a Black person in that entire country because they never had any Afro-descendant African people representatives there. After the call for the World Conference happened and the organizing for that, they had to begin to diversify their delegation to at least on a surface level have it reflect that the majority of the people in Brazil are Black or people of African descent. So I think that was another aspect of that, and it also in those countries highlighted the fact that the type of discrimination that was going on inside the United States, for example, or in Canada, was going on inside of those countries, and that's what we encountered in terms of when David talked about the countries that are compliant with the U.S. They carried out that same sort of racist policy against their African descendant people in their countries, and so Durban and organizing for Durban, because Durban was just those 5-6 days. It was that whole process of organizing towards Durban that raised up that whole issue and put the struggle of Black folks of people of African descent in the world struggle. And as Barbara said, in this century places the demand for reparations on the same level that the struggle for independence, national independence from colonialism was in the 20th century. Oh, and just one last thing, in terms of that struggle gets represented around real people. in our history in the UN, Sister Esmeralda Brown from Panama. When we first started going to the UN '89, she was the one who gave us, just how do you function in that? And then in that process around dealing with reparations, Sister Yvette Modestine is another person who's instrumental in terms of that process of bringing people, non-English speaking peoples and what they represent in our collective struggle into that arena. So I think it's important, like you say, to hold up folks who have carried that banner.
Thank you, Roger. Barbara?
Thank you. Just to say, I've popped into the chat the URL from our last session that dealt with the Durban conference. I will also share with you, I can't find them now, but the URLs on UNTV, which is a very obscure, opaque, you have to know where to go find it. The URLs for the 35th session that focused on reparatory justice, as well as the report coming out, which was just presented to the Human Rights Council in October. It's really UN issues. Sorry, it's really a UN process, so that even if you have a meeting in November of 2023, which we did, it only goes to the Human Rights Council in October of the following year. So there's this kind of time lag before you have something that you can really work with among constituents. But I'll make sure that through Roger, I send the URLs for the 35th session that focused on reparatory justice and the report.
Thank you, Barbara. We have a bunch of questions, but I want, in trying to not ask all of the questions, because I think they're getting to a common theme. And we've talked about the role of the US as being the most aggressive state against Durban. And most recently, the Trump administration pulling funding from the Permanent Forum of African Descent. So the question that comes from that, and it's many different questions that get at, one, the US's non-participation or even acknowledgement of Durban, but also its aggressive opposition. I think this highlights something that Roger just mentioned, especially when we think about the Western Hemisphere. We're talking about approximately 250 million people whose situation might be closer to African people in the US, in that we have an antagonistic state that's not going to do any of the work of organizing reparations, where it must be civil society. So I guess the question, in terms of the United States, not just in the US, but being antagonistic, as David mentioned at the prep cons, what is the strategy against the US, organizing in the US and beyond, where we're seeing a heightening of fascism, in just to highlight Venezuela, but also Nigeria? The push for reparations in this context, what type of organizing does it require, particularly amongst civil society? So I know I just pushed a lot out there, but I think that conversation can then branch off to a couple other questions I think people are asking. But the vast majority of African people in the Western Hemisphere exists in states in which we cannot rely on governments to do the work of demanding reparations. So, what type of organizing must we elevate in 2026 to highlight Durban, but also to move our movement forward? So, I'll go to Roger, and then other people can chime in after.
Okay. To start out with, the nature of the U.S. opposition, as David said, not only from Santiago, but from the first PrepCom, when their representative, who was a Black woman, said, we're not going to deal with the reparations. And that's been consistent, that as soon as they walked out of Durban, and from that moment on, they've blocked, they don't even mention it. And unfortunately, because of the finances of the United Nations, the Western European and other group, who is that group of all former colonizers or settler colony states, has an undue influence. And so you do not always get the office. The High Commissioner of Human Rights is supposed to be, that office is supposed to be the secretariat for the United Nations, but it's unfortunately it often falls under the undue influence and sway of the WEO group. And so therefore, instead of having
Say who the
a
WEO group
follow,
is.
oh, the WEO is the Western European and other group. I'm sorry. Um, the normal process would have been for a follow-up to Durban would have been 5 years later in 2006. Every World Conference has a 5-year follow-up. That didn't happen, and it only happened 8 years later because of the pressure coming from NGOs, the civil society, in terms of forcing them to do that. And so the situation we face, and so you don't get the emphasis. You don't see a 2026 campaign coming out of the UN around let's celebrate Durban because, as I said, the influence, the extra behind the table, behind the door influences discourage that. So it's on us to, as in the same way that we organize for the importance of Durban and taking people there within our countries, particularly in the ones when we're in countries who are antagonistic to this, to highlight Durban. I think people talked about having programs, and but also to educate our people to see why reparations is important to them, that it's not an abstract kind of concept, but what will it mean in terms of the struggle to improve the quality of life of our people? Because reparatory justice, as Barbara and the other panelists have said, is more than simply a paycheck. It's what are the conditions, what are the legacies that we're surviving from that are a reflection of that? And when we can educate our folks to see, oh, that's what this means, it will get their participation in the type of street activities and meetings and pressure that you within your own society to make that happen. Unfortunately, there aren't that many societies to deal with it. And let me just say, kind of ironically, not ironically, that one of the countries, Venezuela, under Presidents Chavez and Maduro, have always been pushing for improvement of the quality of life of people of African descent. So much so that in 2018, Venezuela held a national conference on reparations for African people. And I was there, and there were people from around the international community, but they took that up. That's one of the tasks set out by Durban and by the International Decade and by the working group. But that's the exception in terms of it, that you haven't seen that in other countries. So I think that's what our struggle is. How do we organize our folks to see the importance of that in the same way that people organized in colonized countries for our situation can only be resolved through national independence, to get people to see that our situation can only be improved with us pushing this demand for reparations and reparatory justice.
Roger, I need to say that it's not correct to say that Venezuela is the exception, because right now, the two countries in South America with the largest African populations, Brazil and Colombia, the state is very much involved in reparations work
Correct.
and reparations organizing. In fact, Brazil is pushing an initiative to have to include within the UN Sustainable Development Goals reparations, and they're a little bit hesitant about putting it forward now because you would need to reopen the question of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and you could have a backward aggressive government like the US seeking not to add but to remove some of the existing goals. But the plan is that once the time is right, that Brazil will be putting forward reparatory justice as one of the sustainable development goals. So of course, in Colombia, you have Vice President Francia Marquez, a Black woman, historic election of this for the first time in the history of Colombia. A Black woman who was elected Vice President of Colombia, and she has made reparations her major work as Vice President. The unfortunate thing is that her term is soon coming to an end in this year, she and President Petro. But so we will see. We will see what type of administration will replace them. But some important work has been done and is continuing in those two very important Latin American countries. Of course, right across the Caribbean community, we are all majority Black or African countries, with the exception of Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana, where you do have a large East Indian population. But in Guyana, in spite of that large East Indian population, that government has also strongly supported the reparations agenda. Trinidad and Tobago, we'll have to see. We'll have to see what happens there in coming months. But in the Caribbean, the reparations idea is strongly embraced at the level of our governments. Yeah.
Thank you, David. Barbara?
Moderator, thank you so much. I want to say that in the Caribbean, we have two types of social societies in terms of race. One is those countries where people of African descent are the majority. You get to Jamaica, it's what, 94% or whatever. And in the Caribbean, where in Guyana, it's 41%. Suriname, it's actually more than 50%. But what the government has done very, very nicely is to divide them into two groups so that when you look at data, you can be fooled about the Maroons and persons on the coast. And so that obfuscates the data, and Trinidad and Tobago. I'm going to say very, very clearly, as I've said for a long time, it's impossible for governments that suppress and oppress and persecute Black people to authentically go on the world stage and argue for our reparations. That's one layer of it. The second layer of it is that we've begun to see a schism between indigenous peoples and people of African descent. And this is one of the factors that is pushing for a declaration for people of African descent, because indigenous peoples are breaking away. We see that with Black people in Latin America who, because the original indigenous peoples had been wiped out, like the Garifuna and what have you, have been part of that indigenous movement for a long while. But there's a schism that's going there. For example, when we went to Suriname for our fact-finding visits, as the working group does fact-finding visits last year, it was muted as an MU, but there was quite an explicit comment from one of the indigenous groups that we're not going to support anything to do with land ownership for Black people because we're the original people of Suriname. And I want to be very clear that in Guyana, born and bred, passport, inclination, passionate about, not only is the situation toxic, but the situation is inimical to the best interest of people of African descent. And that is not something that has permeated, I think, the Caribbean or the world. It's a small story about a small group of people, but it I think is emblematic of subterranean challenges that we have to face as global Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. I think the comments you and Roger just touched on, particularly the role of states and how the contradictions that might come up in pursuing reparations appear, especially when those states are antagonistic to African people. Um, I want to kind of merge two questions, one coming from Jewel Crawford and another one coming from Brian. Forgive me, I don't want to butcher the last name. But the question from Jewel, and I'm paraphrasing, is is something needed like the conference in Barbados following Durban that eventually led to the Global African Congress to really commemorate, you know, 25 years of Durban and, the continued struggle. And of course, this webinar is bringing up some of these issues which we don't think could be resolved in a webinar, but in a meeting such as that. But also, Brian mentioned that there might be some ideological tension, even in the comments where Mally talked about how people put to the side some of the ideological differences to work together. And then earlier, Barbara talked about how some of those differences, whether it's the question of intersectionality, can derail the movement. So I think those two things, what type of meeting spaces do we need? Well, it's one thing, really. What type of meeting spaces do we need to really push our reparations movement agenda forward? And how do we have to deal with some differences that we cannot avoid, particularly the role of states that might offer some of the sharpest contradictions to what we're fighting for? Mally?
So as we have been going through this process, I've just been, thinking about what this looks like on a college campus at a HBCU like Clark Atlanta University, and what this offers us. And I think we have to seize every opportunity. What this offers us is, in a historical context, we're saying, and we're 25 years later, the Durban Declaration. I would frame it as the Durban Declaration, a Pan-African international law, because I teach law, so I got to tie it to that victory to be built upon. And what I think it does is it highlights a couple of tensions that currently exist. One of them is some of our young people are being co-opted to um, disassociate with being African, instead to more associate with being to identifying with the former condition of one generation of ancestors. Because before we were enslaved, and while we were enslaved, we were still people of African descent. And so that attack on being African within the United States reparations movement is a issue that has to be addressed. And I think even having a mini conference or in-person sessions around Durban so that people can understand. I agree completely with what Roger shared. When we got to Durban, I saw African people with my own eyes, from Colombia and from, this is not, you talk about it, but to see it, it's like, oh, okay, yeah, they're just in a different, um caught up in a different system, but they are African people struggling, fighting, and making the similar demands. And I think this gives us an opportunity to expose young people to international law, international organizing, and to Pan-African thought, and how we, the importance of us moving as Pan-Africanists. We're the only people that they say we should disassociate with where we are originally from, because it is to their benefit that we disassociate, that we will shrink our numbers rather than being a part of a massive group of people of African descent around the globe. They would want to reduce us to people whose ancestors were formerly enslaved. That's a losing strategy, right? And we've got to expose it as such, and that it's not consistent with our culture, it's not consistent with our political work, and it is a development that is really birthed to destroy the reparations movement and our movement. And so I think, I just lift that up as what my intentions are, if I can get our local folks here. And the last piece is that the work that's happening on the local levels is still important. It's critically important work. It's an entry point for local people to enter the movement, right? Around reparations. So, like the work in Evanston, we're doing work like that in the city of Decatur. It's an entry point. And now folks that are organizing in Decatur, Georgia, right outside, and the work is being done with Atlanta, and the Fulton County Commission just released a harm report. These are entry points for everyday people nationalized to the larger international reparations movement.
Could I say that the concept that is taking root all around the world is the concept of global Africa. So we are all understanding that we are one global African family. And of course, the reparations issue is perhaps the fundamental issue that is pertinent to the entirety of global Africa. So one would imagine that, African people in the United States would need to see themselves as a component of global Africa, that global African civilization. Now, somebody had raised the question about how how are you going to resist this Trump phenomenon and all the people who are associated with him. But obviously, in order to resist, you need institutions of resistance. So I would think that the issue is what institutions will the Black community of the United States of America mobilize around um, to resist that fascist onslaught. From my vantage point here in Barbados, I mean, the critical institutions that took our struggle forward here in the Caribbean, the really critical institutions were the political parties and the trade unions. It was a broad labor movement centered in trade unions and political parties that fundamentally, took forward our struggle. And so I'm very keen here in Barbados to try my very best, to keep those trade unions, political parties, progressive, strong, rooted, because we understand that that is an institutional structure um, where resistance can be deployed. But I would think that that's the question now for you in the United States of America. What are the institutions that if they don't, if they're not currently equipped for that resistance, but that you can work with them or you can work on them to equip them ideologically for that resistance, which is so critical right now. So I just leave that there.
Thank you, David. we're now at 155. So first, as we begin to wrap up, what I want to do is actually just go through some announcements, some things that December 12th has planned for the year-long commemoration of Durban, but also mention some of the things that happen regularly in the UN that should also be part of our continuing the effort. Um, and then following that, we're going to do something that might prove to be a little bit more difficult. I want each of the panelists to wrap up their thoughts in 2 minutes. 2 minutes to really just reflect on the conversation today. And I think, what should be the sticking point moving forward. And I'll say that with the idea that there was a lot of good questions, some of the questions that got really into the weeds that maybe this webinar is not able to address. But I think the idea of, you know, specific meetings, international meetings that, pushes reparations forward where civil society can really engage each other as well as, some of the state actors, which is the Durban model. So with that being said, one thing that was mentioned that everyone may not be aware of, we are in the second decade of we're in the second international decade of people of African descent, which started January of 25, that goes into January of 2034. So the idea, even the reason that we're in the second decade, is that we did not do enough in the first decade. So it really is a question and a conversation of how do we see this movement going forward into the future and the measurable goals that Barbara talked about earlier. Second, the permanent forum for people of African descent is April 14th and 17th. I think there needs to be some continued dialogue and serious conversation of people, especially in civil society, going into the conference. I think the forum, I think something that Mally said earlier, and everybody indicated that the prep cons are where, things get done, where declarations are made, and then the actual meeting is where it's staged. So it is a conversation about leading up to the permanent forum, which will be April 17th through April 14th through 17th in Geneva, Switzerland. Um, the December 12th movement, um, we're planning for August 29th to be our mass rally in commemoration in New York City to really, make people know that Durban is alive and well. So it's our mass effort to get everyday people to understand the significance of Durban, but we also want to reach as broadly as possible too. So it will be us in the streets, in the community, um, panels, rallies, things all organized around making Durban actionable. Beyond that, we have the UN, several dates of remembrance. Um, we have the week of March 21st, the week of solidarity with people struggling against racism and racial discrimination. The 25th of March is the International Day of Remembrance of Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade. August 23rd is the International Day for Remembrance of the Slave Trade and its abolition. And then August 31st is the International Day for People of African Descent. So these are all days that are already recognized, which easily yield towards, concerted organizing by different groups to not just let these days or this decade pass without us knowing that our efforts could be highlighted. Um, Last point, this conversation, this webinar brought out so many great points, some of which whole chapters could be written about. And I think that brings up the central weakness of people remembering Durban is that we have to have, all types of materials that promotes the existence of Durban. So the Durban 400, the movie, which everybody can access on Vimeo and YouTube, is perhaps one of its kind. I don't know how many other, videos at length talks about, what happened. And even the Durban 400, probably needs several more parts, but that was the struggle of an independent, producer, Al Santana and Iman Drame, of producing a work that, if without that, we might not have anything. But we're talking about book chapters, edited volumes, and people who know of other things that are already written that could be part of a resource database to continue compiling information. All of that is certainly welcome. So, in the ways in which you register for the event, and we'll communicate with you following this webinar. Please continue to share any of the resources that will help people continue to know about Durban. And of course, because as Barbara said earlier, we're everyday people who are involved in many different aspects of our societies. We want to be able to make sure that we can reach people where they are. So myself as an academic, I want to make sure that the academic community in the US and beyond have on record this Durban event, and without, you know, um, having to, search in the crates or in the most dusty corners to find it. That being said, the point of Durban is that we have some work to do. We have international work to do. We have work to do in our communities, and we have to all bring it together under an idea of Pan Africanism, us being a global African people. So, with that being said, I want to pass it over in the opposite order in which we started. So, to close out, 2 minutes, Colette has the hook. So, we'll close out first with Mally, then Barbara, then David, then Roger. You have to unmute.
All right. Yeah. So again, it is an absolute honor. This has been very powerful. I just want to lift up the work of the National Black United Front. We just ask that you would go follow the work of MBUF. We have the annual caravan for the ancestors to Galveston. And I know that out of this conversation, the chapters and the organizers around the country will look to do things locally in our respective locations. And so we are clear around the issue of Pan-Africanism and reparations. And we have also, one of the things that uh, Baba Dr. Conrad Worrell would raise is that we all have to be in organizations. If we hope that you would join MBUF, that you will connect with us wherever you are. But I'm also a member of NCOBRA and also a member of NCBL, and then locally the Beacon Hill Black Alliance for Human Rights. Please get in an organization. If you're in an organization, let this inspire you to do something around Durban. Claim this is it. When we have a victory, we have to stand on it. This is a victory that we must stand on. And so I'm challenging us, and we're going to do our part in Atlanta. I hope to do something with y'all in Chicago to commemorate this victory and to build on it, to say we won and not we won but we won, and the and is the rest of the history that will be written by us and by those who will come after us as they learn about Durban and the way that we win. And again, I'll close how I started, straight ahead, like Matulu said. Peace.
Thank you, Mally. Barbara.
Thank you, everybody, for inviting me. As usual, I've learned and hope I've shared. We've got some solid outputs to work on. If you Google, only CARICOM has promulgated the second decade. That means we have 100 and something countries that have said or done nothing. If you're in a country like the US, it will have to be done at state level or city level. So there's some work to be done on that one. Second, encourage your representatives to contribute positively to the negotiations for the Declaration on People of African Descent. So those are some solid concrete outputs. And the third one in that is push for a program of action for the second decade. A year has already passed. It went by in a flash, but we do need program of action for the second decade that we can monitor and to which we can contribute, so that maintain the four areas of focus: the unfinished work of the first decade on anti-racism in all its forms, maintain the work on reparatory justice, step up the work on environmental justice, and ramp up the work on digital justice. That's our future. And then the last point, we need to figure out what we do with the people who look like me, who disperse a lot of energy, and they are being instrumentalized and weaponized one more time to undermine what we're doing. We can't go off to them, they are our brothers, but we need to neutralize them through education, through employability, through employment, as we build that intergenerational channel for moving things forward. Again, thank you very much, and happy 2026, everybody.
Thank you, Barbara. David?
Thank you. I would end where I began. I began by praising and thanking December 12th movement for keeping their eyes on the prize of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. And I think in this 25th anniversary year, it would be good to bring that message home to the governments of global Africa, that this was your creation, or you played a very big part in the creation of this document, which really outlines a blueprint for the advancement of African people, for the pursuit of reparations, but it's a blueprint that we have not used sufficiently over the last 25 years. So I would think that I would certainly make that effort within CARICOM and with the CARICOM Reparations Commission. But I think D12 could make that part of your work this year to push that idea at governments of global Africa, and not only governments, but of course civil society, Pan-African organizations as well. But the governments are so important. I would also like to say that Jewel raised a good point about having an international conference to mark the 25th anniversary, but that is going to call for a lot of effort and organizing. But we do have the upcoming session of the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent, an institution that has just come under attack from the United States government, and they're pulling out of it. So their representative will disappear, and anyhow. So, but I think that we should all make an effort to attend the session in Geneva in April, to be there, to give support. I think it's a very important institution, a UN institution that emerged out of the Durban process, and we need to support it. And we can use that session in April to highlight the Durban Declaration, the fact that this is the 25th year, and that we are insisting that this Durban document be made a crucial part of our agenda, of our manifesto going forward with reparations. So I think if we can do those things, we would have set a good platform for better use of the Durban document as a foundational document in our struggle.
Thank you, David. Last but not least, Roger Wareham.
First, I'd like to thank the panelists for participating in this. I'd like to thank the people who've registered because we've maintained a pretty high participation during the entire thing, which is really kind of unusual. And I thank you. And at the same time, I remember the words of Viola Plummer, our late chairperson, who always said, well, I don't know if I really need to be thanking you for being somewhere where you're supposed to be. But thank you for being that place where you're supposed to be. I think that what we wanted to come out of this was one, just raising up Durban for people to just at least know what it is, and its significance, and that we don't have a lot of victories, but when we have them, we need to treasure them and we need to learn from them. And I think that's what we've pulled out of this, and then it's set a sort of framework for now. Where do we go forward? We need to use every institution. I mean, I hear what Jewel was saying, and I hear what David was saying. Those international gatherings that are already scheduled, we need to participate in, and we need to come and bring our agenda. The permanent forum on its own is not going to highlight the DDPA unless we make it do so. And until for just terms of historically, the United States and Canada were very fervent supporters of the permanent forum because they were juxtaposing it to the DDPA. It was like, don't deal with the DDPA. The permanent forum is going to start anew after the DDPA, which was a reflection of how seriously dangerous the U.S. and the Western European group of other countries understand what the DDPA represents, so that we need to go into that forum, understand that the fact that Trump has now said he's not going to deal with it doesn't change the fact they still perceive that as a vehicle that can derail the lethality of the DDPA in terms of assuring our demands for reparations. So I think that's how we need to approach it, just as we did with Durban. We need to come organized. We need to come with an agenda and use that as a vehicle to pull people together, to pressure the governments to do what they're supposed to do. Because as we say in the United States, all the local initiatives are important, but in the final analysis, it's the U.S. government that's going to have to be responsible to take up the question of reparatory justice, without all with all the diversions that they create. So that we look at these as steps towards that, as I think Valerie said, bringing people into motion. On behalf, and Jahi was saying, on behalf of the December 12th movement, I'm inspired by what we've heard. I'm inspired by the turnout. I'm inspired by the support. This is being recorded. It's going to be packaged. People need to send it out so that we can reach the people who are not able to participate or to attend today, and just use this as a stepping stone and to move forward. I think the other thing would be, is the working group going to be when's their next meeting? Is their next open meeting in terms of 2026 that also people can participate in, Barbara?
November.
In November?
And I'll share with you what
Geneva or New York?
It's scheduled for New York this year because we were just in Geneva.
Okay.
So, and I will share with you what the thematic focus will be.
Okay. Thank you. So, as we, as we said in the beginning, our theme then and now is they stole us, they sold us, they owe us reparations now. Thank you.